In the mid to late 70s, the pioneers of LA hard rock and metal paved the way for the LA metal explosion that followed in the early 80s. Meanwhile, there was also an underground metal movement in Los Angeles that was heavily influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal. Seeking to break new ground, these young, innovative artists set forth to play music both faster and heavier than their predecessors could have possibly dreamed. This bold and fearless movement manifested as the rise of LA thrash metal.
Yeah, kidnap a poser and set him on fire and tie him to a chair and beat him up. Yeah, I watched them do stuff like that.
We were kind of too punk for a lot of metal people, and we were too metal for a lot of punk people. But I said, well, this is who we are.
Heavy metal and thrash metal and all that is like the classical music of today.
But with Los Angeles, we had our scene. Beyond Slayer, Metallica, and Arcadia. A lot of these bands that some were only at that demo stage.
LA did not get the credit. It was stolen from San Francisco. They took all the credit.
We were all hanging out together. We were all united around the belief in this music, and it brought us together.
But it was amazing that people worked that hard. It was like building a pyramid back in the 80s.
It's really easy to feed off people going insane in front of you. And it doesn't matter how tired you are, it doesn't matter if you're hungover, it doesn't matter what's going on.
And then someone gave me some Led Zeppelin, some Deep Purple, and that was it, After I heard those notes, I was just turned on,
We took the baton from Deep Purple and Judas Priest and all them guys. We took the fast stuff they did and made our own thing. The other bands took what we did and changed it and did their thing. That's the way it goes.
It was just crazy. It was youth. It was youth.
Before the term thrash metal, bands such as Metallica and Slayer were characterized as speed metal, or occasionally power metal. Proclaiming themselves the heaviest and fastest of all heavy metal bands became the credo of Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth, who in their early stages constantly competed for this vital medal of honor.
It wasn't like, I'm going to form a band and turn it all upside down. There was none of that shit whatsoever. It was literally, I was into all the bands you mentioned, passionate about music, kind of disenfranchised with tennis, and even though I wasn't like one of these, I wasn't like a sort of like a bad student or anything like it. Just school was just school. It wasn't something I hated. It wasn't something I loved. It was just there. I went to school, but I wasn't passionate about anything. I was passionate about music.
When I made the statement about we are the fastest band in the U.S., I got crucified for that one. I would get yelled at outside of nightclubs for that. I mean, I had people chewing me out left and right when I put that one out.
That's something that Dave has done all the way down to this very day. He always finds somebody that compliments him in an opposite way, I guess. I don't know. Where he has his sound, he always gets somebody that has their own unique thing, and he's a genius at that.
And it's funny because we were essentially a three-piece, and I think when I met Dave, it was looking like it would be a five-piece. There'd be four and a singer, and then the singer went away. Dave steps up to the mic on New Year's Eve after another ill-fated vocalist audition went south. The guy didn't show up.
We were basically into stuff like Kiss and the Ramones and the Dead Boys. But at the same time, we were also into the Scorpions and Frank Marino and Mahogany Rush and Yesterday and Today, which was extremely underground at that point. So we had chops, but we were really punks, and we were like really crazy kids. But we had like energy and like this punk attitude, real snotty, and we were just really into riffing out and going crazy on guitar.
And I've seen Lars's ad in the Recycler a couple weeks before, and he was running an ad, and I finally called him up. Then I met him. Then I find out that he knows a lot about the music and he's really into it. At the time, he would just rent in a drum set and we hang out and we jam. And I think I went and pick up a tape first. Then I take the tape home and learn the songs that he wanted me to learn.
That was the beautiful part of metal back then. Of all those, because we had all those genres of metal starting out at that era, the beginning of thrash and the beginning of speed and the beginning of crossover and the beginning of extreme metal, and all that stuff started in the 80s.
But there are some other bands that people tend to forget too that were, kind of fueling it too, because they were doing a little bit more of a traditional metal thing. There were bands like Savage Grace, and obviously Armored Saint was happening, and there are other bands that, like, I mean, I'm not just saying this to be cool, but you gotta remember there was Malice and there was obviously Warrior.
The thrash scene was coming into being in LA, and I truly think, yes, it started in LA, not the Bay Area. And in LA, you have and will always have the Hollywood glam scene and the Hollywood scene itself, but you also had all these bands that were coming about because of Venom and Motorhead and these heavier Angel Witch, these deathly satanic bands that were so full of color and artwork and awesome music that you're forced into just looking at this shit going, what, this is awesome.
And the heavier bands were super underground. I mean, look, Metallica was really the first ones that started being really heavy. And they just never really found a home here because the scene started to change. Like right about 83, it started to change a little bit. And as soon as they left, then all of a sudden you had Slayer came in, and Omen, and Savage Grace, and a bunch of these bands.
Los Angeles had always taken a back seat when it came to thrash metal, being overshadowed by the then thriving Bay Area thrash movement, or perhaps the fact that the glam metal scene took precedence in LA. But the fact remains, 3 out of the big 4 of thrash, Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth, all hail from Los Angeles.
Those bands, the hair metal bands, gave the thrash scene a bad name in a sense, and a lot of the bands didn't want to be involved with the Hollywood scene, so a lot of the bands would play in the outskirts. The Balboa Theaters, Megadeth shows out there, the Suicidal Tendencies. I mean, it's the Olympic Auditoriums. Yeah, LA got kind of shortchanged on the credit of thrash.
I think the fact that San Francisco gets the credit from Metallica, because that's where they kind of got their really big break, was up there. And obviously Testament, Death Angel, Exodus. People look back and go, oh, because the people that weren't there didn't really see it. And while San Francisco was awesome and the scene was great up there and there were all these great heavy bands, we had such a phenomenal scene here that never really got the due just because it was so overshadowed by everything else.
For us, what we wanted to do is try to take it up a level, but we knew it was going to be tougher in LA because of the hair bands. You had all that going on too. So, but it fueled, like you said, it fueled all the LA thrash bands as well, because we were like, well, we want to kick ass, even though these guys are getting all the chicks coming to their shows. Our shows were like 99.9 dudes.
That's one thing I noticed, especially with the thrash metal stuff that happened in LA, was outside of LA, it was not like in England where a lot of this stuff was kind of getting big and you had the Kerrangs of the world talking a lot about it. They rarely ever talked about the LA bands. It was always about Death Angel and Exodus and Testament and all the bands up there. So you don't get any credit to Megadeth, even though another LA band started here. They never get credit as being an LA band either. So.
Due to the overwhelming popularity of glam and pop metal in Los Angeles, many thrash bands were genuinely ashamed to be labeled an LA band. The ultimate goal of any given thrash band in the early 80s was to tour Europe, thus establishing instant credibility. But until that goal was met, many LA thrash bands took the opportunity to drive 7 hours north to the San Francisco Bay Area, where both the venues and audience were much more accommodating to this aggressive underground metal movement.
The LA scene, thrash-wise, has to be linked with the Bay Area San Francisco scene. I don't see how you can actually pull them apart. Metallica started in LA and then moved to San Francisco. And realistically, you have to look at the likes of Testament and Exodus out in San Francisco, and the likes of Slayer and, to a lesser extent, Armored Saint in LA, and link it as a total combination. Yes, I know us Brits tend to think that San Francisco is a 2-minute walk from LA, when it's 2 hours or so on a plane. But the fact is, those two scenes were inherently linked. So thrash was coming out of that scene from both cities. inspired by the new wave of British heavy metal, obviously. You had Maiden, Venom, Raven, Diamond Head. They were crucial to the way it was developing. But all those bands had something in common. They were different to each other. Metallica didn't sound like Slayer, who didn't sound like Armored Saint. And that's what made it interesting.
So Dave says we're not playing any shows in LA because we're not playing any of the clubs. And the truth of it is there was so much going on here, and the Sunset Strip was so attractive to every band, every record label, managers, everybody in the business, that all of a sudden the clubs turned into this pay-to-play thing. And you know, so what Dave said, he goes, we're going to go up to the Bay Area because that's where real thrash metal's happening. And it wasn't called thrash metal at that time. Thrash metal was just a word that, I don't know, some journalist came up with.
Someone, and to this day, no one knows who invented the term thrash. People still argue about, I've been accused of coming up with it. I never did, I know that. And I know a few other people who have actually been accused of coming up with it. But whatever it was that linked it, the fact is that the best bands in that ilk were different to each other. And that's what made the scene happen.
I remember when Mustaine invited Abattoir to go up to play in the Bay Area, up at Ruthie's Inn and the Stone in San Francisco. And at the time they had Kerry King on guitar filling in. And I think once Abattoir and Megadeth started going up to the Bay, there was a separation, and the separation kind of happened. Where we, you know, some of the bands, even Metallica, I guess they were the first to go up to the Bay, relocate up there. So right around that time, these different genres of metal kind of started happening.
We kept trying to break in the LA thing because we knew the record labels weren't looking in Orange County. You had to be in Hollywood. So even though we were just failing miserably there, we kept going again and again and again. But then they would stick us with bands like St. Valentine. Yeah.
We were just glad to get out in the club and play. We weren't looking for money or anything like that. We got to go play. We got to show people what we can do. And we play for free. And all of a sudden, we see where if you need to play in a club, you got to pay. Because the bands get so shitty that when they book the club, no one comes to see them, so the club lose a lot of money. Right. So they say if you're going to come here and play, you got to pay to play.
And as much as my goal was to come here, once we got the band going, it was like, let's get the hell out of here. And so for me, I think being worldly pretty quickly at a young age, you know, getting in, we start Megadeth, I'm 18, by 19 we're playing shows in the Bay Area, and by 20 we're making a record. By 21 I'm already in New York, and by 22 I'm already going around the world. I mean, those experiences at such a young age really got me pretty worldly and pretty sharp pretty quick.
We busted our butt, like I said, with the flyers. We'd go to every high school. We'd stick a flyer in every single locker in 5 high schools in the area that the nightclub was in. Still, it didn't pan out. Nothing was panning out then because the music scene itself was very progressive rock. I remember that's when August Redmond came out, and that kind of turned me on there. But other than that, the bands they were sticking us with were Journey copies, cover bands, and so we couldn't build an audience. And then when you talk about going to Los Angeles, we were never accepted in LA, ever.
I'm going to see these shows, and they're giving me this hope that there's more to life than just growing up in the streets. So instantly we wanted to be rock stars.
'70s British bands Motorhead, Venom, Raven, Saxon, Maiden, Tank, and Diamond Head were all extremely instrumental in birthing thrash metal. Not to mention European acts Accept and Merciful Fate, which also influenced other Eurothrash outfits like Destruction, Sodom, Creator, Hellhammer, and Bathory.
New Wave of British heavy metal is the most important, significant metal movement ever. And there will never be another movement that can match its importance and impact, because it hit everything and everyone. Partly because of the music, which was exciting and dynamic and driven, partly because of the ethic, which is very much DIY, and partly because there was no image. so that you could almost anybody can get on the stage and do what the Wobbin bands did. And it was only later that Immy started to play a part with the likes of Def Leppard and so forth. So the influence it had on the LA scene was, I think it encouraged people, kids, to say, I can be in a band, I can get on stage, and I can play an instrument.
All these bands started emerging who were following in the footsteps of the new wave of British heavy metal. That opened up big doors, along with Van Halen. That's what I think, you know, and so people wanted to be like these incredible bands that were coming over from Europe, and including us, you know, MX Machine. You know, we started in the footsteps of Armored Saint, and in the world of thrash more though. You know, we were a little bit more on the thrashier punk rock edge, but we came right out of that scene too, and right into the Hollywood scene, which was emerging and changing.
When bands started getting that extreme with bringing in the whole punk influence, you knew it was only going to remain underground. And that was the most important thing for me, is that I hated being so into Iron Maiden and then the world discovered them, you know, being into Motorhead and then the world discovered, you know, whoever it was, you know, Judas Priest would always have a song on the radio, but, you know, so they didn't really count. But, you know, all the heavy bands that I was into, I was always afraid that people were going to discover them, and then they're not my band anymore. And that's part of the elitist thing of being into such extreme underground music, is that my music is cooler than yours, you know, and the stuff that I like, I have to research to get this stuff. You know, you can't just go down to your local Music Plus and pick up the new Praying Mantis record or somebody, you know.
Most of the good guitar players were like into fusion and John McLaughlin and stuff like that, and I really didn't dig that too much, other than for learning purposes. Didn't want to play that. So like I had that, plus I had this metal attitude. So I went to Hawaii. I wanted to do this metal version of this Guitar Mania type of thing.
Right.
And that's how a group called Hawaii was born. Of course, there's like very few musicians in Hawaii who could hang with that. So it was basically me and a drummer, Jeff Graves, and we were into like Raven, and really just into Raven, and doing Raven with like insane guitar playing.
You know, Dave would like, you know, fist feed me Merciful Fate and this and that, you know, and I dug it, especially the King Diamond stuff I really liked. But, you know, we would be playing like Weather Report and whatever we would find out on the road, and then in the morning I'd go, hey, where'd that thing go? And Scott would go, oh, Dave threw it out the window. He would not tolerate any kind of jazz or anything in the bus.
When New Wave British heavy metal exploded and became front page news of sounds, and bands like Leopard and Maiden got signed, it gave me a lot of hope that Diamond Head could get in the press, get in sounds, and get signed too.
The new wave of British heavy metal wasn't all they weren't about the dark riffs necessarily, but just having the overall vibe of that, the high energy, the tempo changes, you know, like Merciful Fate, 10 different songs within a song, you know, that was always cool. And that's one thing that you could not package into a 3-minute radio hit or anything. So having that overall influence on the bands over here, that was just cooler music. It was just, it wasn't easy on the ears, and lyrically it was more challenging than writing about, you know, going to party this weekend with my baby or whatever.
The lyric to Am I Evil is quite extreme for the time. My mother was a witch, she was burned alive. A great opening statement, isn't it? And quite ballsy, you know. It's not my, you know, I love my baby and she loves me, is it? It's a bit more. So there's a lot of energy in that coming through.
At that time, I wanted to play the most extreme metalist music I could possibly do with the most intense guitar possible. Because just before I moved to Hawaii, I discovered the new wave of British heavy metal. Stuff like Angel Witch and Iron Maiden and Praying Mantis. All of that stuff I got because the covers were so rad.
You know, when I heard Motorhead for the first time, it blew my mind. It literally blew my mind. Like, I was like, I don't really even get what these guys are doing, but I like it, you know. And, you know, we started kind of haggling over stuff with the band members because some guys wanted to stick with as heavy as they wanted to go with Van Halen. And I love Van Halen too, but I saw something coming over the horizon.
When I played with Lars over in Port Newport in Orange County, we were. I for instance, would come over and Lars would come back from the Music Mart. Is it Music Mart? Music Mart in Costa Mesa, and he'd get different 45s. It was interesting to see they have a big scene in Europe, France, Italy, Germany at the time.
The Venom album just blew me away. It was just so raw, and so I got into it several weeks before, and then I tried to introduce it to the band. Kerry liked it. Dave hated it. Jeff could care less.
But I remember writing that song in the rehearsal studio. We felt like, this feels really good. It's a lot of fun. It's something we hadn't heard from anybody doing before, and we said, even if nobody buys it, we'll just do it. Fuck it, So
we weren't even aware how fast it was. Right. I remember that we were just, that's great. And later on, we heard from other people, like Anthrax, when they tried the drummer, said, all right, dude, can you play fast as a shark? It was like a test.
Right.
Can you play that fast? But to us back then, we were just.
And we had no idea that it was that much of an influence on other people, because, like we were saying earlier, it was the day before the internet. So who should have told a bunch of guys in Germany that everybody in the US or wherever was really going nuts over this song? But it was later that people told us about that. But at the time, we had no clue.
There was a kind of slow, heavy doominess to Sabbath, wasn't there? Which is, of course, fantastic. I love Black Sabbath, but sometimes you want a bit more speed, don't you? And we saw bands like Judas Priest as well, who had some very fast songs. And I think we liked that about Judas Priest, that occasionally they would go into the Sinner or Exciter or...
Many will argue that punk rock played an even more crucial role than the new wave of British heavy metal when it came to influencing the thrash genre, claiming that punk inspired the energy, speed, and aggressive behavior of thrash.
I mean, you'd already had Motörhead, and people used to say Motörhead was almost punk, weren't they? Because it was very raw, vocals are, not very melodic.
Most of the punk was sloppy and noisy and horrible tones, where even though the production values weren't great on the new wave of British heavy metal stuff, I mean, it was real playing, real songs. It's more song orientated, and of course there were singers.
Some of the harder punk stuff did show up on my radar. When I was in Denmark, I saw the Ramones. I saw the Sex Pistols. I had the first, obviously, couple of Ramones records, the first Sex Pistols. When the Dead Kennedys record came out, Fresh Fruit, and the singles 80, 81, that certainly showed up on my radar. A lot of the other LA stuff, the Circle Jerks and Black Flag and so on, I think I was aware of it, but I can't say that I spent a lot of time listening to that stuff. And I certainly, I think I respected it and had an understanding of it, but I don't remember going sort of, I'm going to go see Black Flag or the Circle Jerks or X or any of that stuff. That certainly didn't happen. And I was aware of, the scene in Huntington Beach and, and so on, but it at that time, as silly as it sounds, 30 years later, it wasn't just metal enough for me. I was so... it was just so one-dimensional, in my outlook.
We were the first generation to have both punk rock and heavy metal records in our record collection. Just our particular age group of, and let's call it the Big Four for starters, but it would certainly include the guys in Exodus, Overkill, Dark Angel, those of us who were in what is now known as thrash metal. So we had our, Sex Pistols and Ramones and Dead Boys records. And also we were into Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and heavy riffing kind of music. So that is really musically what you hear as the convergence of those two coming together. And Los Angeles didn't really, at least in the mainstream, didn't really pay much attention to it. It was more into the glam, to the fashion of it. the hair. It was about a look, as a lot of things in Los Angeles are. It's the movie and TV capital of the world, and so things are always very fashion driven in Los Angeles. And our kind of music wasn't. It was not fashion driven at all. It was about attitude, and we were really, kind of born out of garage band kind of mentality, and rough around the edges, which is why punks liked it. But because it had this, more, not really educated, but just better proficiency to the playing, because we also grew up on metal records. We grew up on Priest and Sabbath and Zeppelin and these kind of things. Our playing was quite good, better than punk guitar playing, but with the speed and the aggression that punk had. So that's what I think made it appeal to punks, and it also made it cool with metalheads, because before that, punk and metal were divided campuses for sure.
I remember going to UK Subs. I remember going to GBH. Several punk bands in those days, and seeing Suicidal at the Concert Factory in Orange County.
We pull up to the club and we're opening, or the Mentors are opening for us. Right. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. So yeah, that happened a lot. We would play with, you wouldn't know who was gonna show up.
I remember playing in North Hollywood with Circle Jerks. Right. It was Slayer, Circle Jerks, and some other bands. I forget who it was. And there was, and I think all that started with Motorhead.
Our bass player went down to Pollywog Park and saw the very first Black Flag gig, and he said kids were running up with their food from their picnic and throwing a Black Flag. And it was pretty funny. My friend said, "You should have seen these guys. They're just like us 5 years ago, And we got to know Keith, and a lot of those bands, like the guys in Black Flag, I think, and the guys in the Dickies, Stevie Fryatt, who used to work on my Marshall amps, and he makes VHT and things like that. Well, he told me, "Oh, we used to go to your gigs."
The two audiences were like oil and water still at the time. They were not going to each other's shows. There was always, punker, hippie, But we were playing both, back and forth. Well, one night, we were playing at Alpine Village in Torrance, and we're driving in there, and I go, oh shit, you got all the metal guys on one side of the parking lot, and you got all the punkers on the other side, and the animosity's already starting. Like, what the hell are you doing here? What the hell are you doing here, Well, this could get quite exciting. So anyway, we come in there with our usual thing there, our Ramones-like blast, and just hit it, And we just tore into it, and all of a sudden the punkers, that's what we wanted. Everybody's on the floor, just the whole action going. And the metal guys weren't used to it. Somebody pushes somebody, pretty soon it's on.
By the time I was getting into thrash metal, I was already into bands like Battalion of Saints from San Diego, and a band from Victoria, Canada called Neos, and they had a little 7-inch EP that had like 12 songs on it or whatever that I thought was amazing. 12 songs on a 7-inch.
Punk rock wasn't really, the bands wasn't really going anywhere. It wasn't really doing it, and bands wasn't elevating. Black Flag, they sound like more like an arty band. Bands were not playing heavy music. They were not aggressive anymore. And they were just like doing this weird music. It's like, I can't listen to that.
Yeah. And I remember one of the guys in the Ramones said that you used to be our favorite band until because we played some shows with them. Yeah, and they didn't like all the songs. He said jamming. He said you guys jam too much. Forgot which one it was, though. That was so long ago. But can't please everybody.
In 1980, on occasion, a bunch of punks, I ended up getting my wrist broken when we were doing the first single. So it was always, punks against skinheads, against hairies, as we were called there. Right. There was no cross-collateralization in England. No, everyone hated each other.
I thought it was awesome seeing those guys. I felt like we were growing, because at first, people didn't know what to do with us. At first, wow, these guys are too fast. They didn't know what to make of us. But then once the word got around, hey, these guys in Slayer, they have this edge to them, that was similar to the punk style. But, you know, we dabbled more into the occult, you know, and evil rather than the anarchy and anti-establishment, you know. So we were different, but it was definitely life-changing musically for me.
Punk was very important, I think, because punk was all about do-it-yourself. So bands were releasing their own singles, promoting their own gigs, put up posters and things like that. So I always think previously to punk, you had your big bands, your Led Zeppelins and your Deep Purples and that, who were like untouchable gods who didn't breathe the same air and all that. So you had no idea how you'd get from being a little band playing pubs to playing stadiums. No idea. So along comes punk rock, and suddenly you've got bands playing pubs again, and bands who aren't particularly good players are on the TV. And you'd think to yourself, oh, in that case, I haven't got to be Richie Blackmore then. I haven't got to sit and practice for 15 years. As long as I can play these power chords, I could do a band right now, and we could write a song, we could do gigs. It was almost like a kick in the arse, I felt.
Though there were many Los Angeles bands that fused the fervor of punk with the musicality of metal, the Weasels were arguably the first crossover punk metal band to emerge in Los Angeles. Formed in the early 70s, the Weasels soon found themselves sharing LA club stages with everyone from Van Halen to the Weirdos. Ensuing crossover LA bands Overkill LA, The Stepmothers, Suicidal Tendencies, Excel, No Mercy, and Cryptic Slaughter soon followed suit. Even conventional LA thrash metal bands Slayer, Dark Angel, and Hyrax began to build loyal followings amongst the punk hardcore audience, and often shared the bill with popular LA punk bands, which tended to create a rather intense friction with the traditional metal crowd.
The way I wrote was the metal, you know, the metal guitar thing. I thought it was real powerful. I thought a lot of the rhythms were like Live at Leeds was one of my albums that modeled my rhythm guitar style, and then I would listen to people like Jeff Beck and Richie Blackmore for my leads, because I thought they were just the best, and I thought, well, why not combine those two elements? We don't have a keyboard to make it, you know, progressive or anything like that, so we might as well just rely on the power, like a classic power trio like Black Sabbath or The Who or something like that. But we have this guy that's making the lyrics up, and it's all from a punk angle, and he's kind of like, his singing style is pretty close to Mick Jagger, David Johansen or something like that, but he tried to keep the humor in the lyrics.
Yeah, Metallica was gone already, and they were playing exclusively with, like, you know, Bay Area thrash bands with the Exodus and stuff like that. Slayer had to kind of decide, who are we going to play with? There's no other bands like us out here. And, you know, Jeff Hanneman was such a punk fan, you know, he said, let's play with punk bands, or, you know, they started playing warehouses and parties with punk bands, and eventually that became the norm. It was not weird to go see Slayer and a punk band, or to see a punk band and a thrash band. It became normal. And a year before that, that was unheard of.
All I knew, honestly, I was a young kid. Remember, I was 17, 18 years old. I didn't know much about the LA scene at all. We knew in New York, and we just saw pictures and, you know, heard records and stuff like that. But a lot of the promo was going with the big hair bands, and that's what was going on. And that was fine for people who liked that. It just wasn't my thing. We would later on get into the CBGB's thing and go Sunday afternoon hardcore shows, and that was great too. And just have a good time down there, and mosh and all that stuff. And it was a great scene. It was very pure.
So I'm skateboarding, listening to punk rock, going to see all the punk bands, Cuckoo's Nest, Whiskey. Go to the Olympic, you will see Possess, you will see all those bands and punk bands at the same time. You go to Florentine Garden, you got Discharge, you see all those bands, Black Flag and Circle Jerks. And I mean, you got Channel 3, you got Channel White, you got Social Distortion before they're actually anything. Bad Religion before they're TSOL. TSOL was like one of my favorite bands back then. You had those bands, but then you had bands like Discharge, GBH, and stuff like that coming from England, and that kind of changed everything. Because it kind of made it more metal, so then everybody started accepting it a little bit more.
Like we all grew up with, early Van Halen, early AC/DC. Then, I got turned on to the Clash and Fear. And I think what it was is that we loved punk rock as much as we loved metal. And, back then we weren't calling it crossover. We were a thrash band.
The one thing that I liked about it was the energy. I don't know how those two things blended, but Dave was really into Fear. And I never had heard Fear. And it got to the point where we wouldn't even go on stage and do a show unless we listened to both, Fear and then More Beer. And we every night, that's what we would listen to before we went on stage. By the time we got out of the bus, man, we were like jumping, ready to go, So there's something about that energy that I think that you're talking about, that crossover energy is what it was about. Maybe not the tone or the music writing, it was just the energy.
I always got a thing about good musicianship, and I was attracted to like jazz, and I was really into fusion, and I still am. But there was a point around that time when I discovered Motorhead, and I got into like punk and thrash, and it was more of, instead of, I liked guys who were really good, but then that at that point I liked the attitude of stuff, and it kind of got us shift, and that suicidal thing happened right around that time, so it was kind of perfect time, because if it happened a year earlier, I probably wouldn't have done it.
When we first started, we played with bands like Necronomicon, Terrorizer, Dark Angel, all great bands. And then we got offered a show with DRI, and this is when DRI, before Dealing With It came out, and the Descendants were headlining. And it was also Excel, and Excel was a band from Venice, which was similar to Cubic Slaughter, but they were still a little more punk rock. Our fan base went from being a lot of long hair guys in denim vests with patches and everything, and as the years and shows went by, we started playing with more punk band. We saw a good uniform unity between the metals and the punk kids, and I think what happened was you had bands like DRI who were getting more into the metal, and then you had the metal bands like Slayer wearing the Dead Kennedy shirts.
So much crossover was going on in the early to mid 80s. It was linked to the thrash scene. You had Suicidal Tendencies, who were much hardcore and punk. You had Anthrax, who actually were a band who embraced rap. So there was an awful lot of interest from thrash bands, and not just being metal, but actually trying to develop something further. They weren't being narrow-minded. The irony is, of course, so many thrash fans were narrow-minded, and if it wasn't straight-ahead metal, they weren't interested. But the bands themselves were prepared to look outside of the narrow vision of metal and take on board other influences, and really they were the progenitors to what's happened ever since.
Never really got the whole separation thing. I always thought it was the energy was the main component, and for some people used to think it's just because they're soloing, that changes it.
When people talk to me now, they say that's a great thrash record, a great punk record. But I really was trying to make a rap record that was metal, because I was more, Led Zeppelin and more Deep Purple than more, DRI and Slash like that.
It wasn't until later in the 80s when we would play at gigs and we were considered like, oh, these guys are professional, and fights would break out in the audience between the punks and the metal guys, stuff like that. They actually threw us out of the Whiskey one time in 82 because a fight started, which we'd had nothing to do with.
We had a punk rock rhythm section. It was myself and then Ron Cordy on bass, and with a long-time hardcore metal player. And I go, oh, this is really exciting.
You were voted actually the best punk band and the worst punk band in the same poll.
You gotta like that. It's good. I mean, you're doing something right. Anything polarizing is good. It makes people go watch or listen to or whatever. You think about Howard Cosell. He was one of those people that either love him or you hate him. And
the one thing I like about Still Prophet, it was a metal band, but it still had like a punk attitude element to it, and it was like Body Count. When I saw Body Count, the band was just like all over the place, and Still Profit. That's what we did. We did the same thing. We just did it, and we won different audiences because of our stage presence.
You know, when you talk about, for instance, the punk and the outside of metal stuff sort of uniting, I mean, a lot of times you got to remember that kind of, you know, one group and another group can unite because they're kind of against this other group. So it's not, you know, like my friend's enemy becomes, you know, my enemy's enemy becomes my friend, you know, that saying. So, you know, I think that, you know, there was probably a common bond against that, whatever it was that was going on in Hollywood at that time, with the fakeness and the make-believe of all these, you know, glam bands and the shallowness of all that type of stuff, that the punks and the heavier metal dudes could kind of bond together against that. Do you know what I mean? So, you know, our thing was that in terms of attitude and in terms of a sense of belonging, we obviously felt much more of a kinship with these guys, but musically, our roots laid, you know, in a lot more traditional metal stuff. So, you know, between Kirk Hammett and James Hetfield, myself, you know, AC/DC, Deep Purple, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Aerosmith, Led Zeppelin, you know, it's sort of, it started off kind of, you know, more in that kind of vein. Sure, Ramones, Motorhead, but that was about the energy, and that was about the attitude. Do you know what I mean? It was like Diamond Head, you know, that type of thing. That was much more where our heart and souls were in terms of the musical element. Do you know what I mean? And so a lot of the punk stuff and so on, I loved the attitude and great, but it wasn't, I mean, we didn't feel a kinship with it, you know, in terms of the musical, the musicality of it.
Hey! Fuck that shit!
Prior to the punk-metal crossover and the founding of thrash metal, it wasn't uncommon to see future metal titans Metallica and Slayer sharing the bill and opening for popular LA and Orange County glam metal bands such as Rat, White Sister, August Red Moon, Witch, and Rock's Regime, who would later become Striper. But as the popularity of thrash metal grew, so did the animosity between thrash and glam.
The funny thing about that show was Striper headline, Metallica, and Hyrax opening. Well, before that we were LA Chaos, right before we changed our name. And I remember, like it was yesterday, after the show, everybody was kind of happy because it was a pretty decent turnout, but nobody got paid because during Metallica, somebody broke a window. Like some kids were slam dancing and they went through a window. So nobody got paid because all the money had to pay for the broken window.
I just remember going in there and having heard about Metallica, but didn't really know anything about them. And we didn't really talk much. I mean, it was just like, hey, how are you guys? That was it. And we were polar opposites, you know, in terms of musicality, musical styles and whatnot. But I mean, you fast forward, Dave was just telling me, Dave and I have become really good friends, and he was a drug dealer, dealing pot and whatnot. He sold pot to our bass player, John Voorhees. And he came to our studio once to invest in the band, Dave. And he saw the yellow and black and just thought, this is whacked. What is this?
I wish I would have known that.
And he wound up not investing in the band, you know. So things worked out. But fast forward 30 years later, and we're buddies, and you know, he's telling me the story in his house, you know, while we were cutting steak, you know, and it's just really trippy how things work out.
You know, he's an awesome guy. He really is, and so are the guys in Metallica. But back then, when Dave was in Metallica, that night I remember he had a lot of beers to drink, and man, he was in my face that night. He was in a fight with Dave.
Oh, was he?
Absolutely.
He was all the time back then.
Well, that's I think why he ended up not in Metallica anymore. He was real aggressive, but he's such a sweetheart. You know, now that you go and hang out with him, you wouldn't even think that at all. But back then, that's what I remember. I remember walking away going, why did this happen? I totally dug those guys.
Since there was no thrash scene, you would be the only thrash band playing, and you would be sandwiched in some bill with 3 other rock bands or whatever. And I think that's kind of when the separation started happening, was as all those LA, now cock rock bands, the majority of them were pretty heavy. There was heavy metal for the time. You would hear more Judas Priest in their material than you would, New York Dolls or whatever that came later. And a lot of those bands were pretty heavy for what they were doing. But then when all that stuff blew up on the radio, and then everybody, started changing their sounds that just seemed like, for me anyway, that just always seemed like such a sellout. Like, a band like Rat, they had some heavy material for what they were doing, but then all of a sudden, they started writing the catchy choruses and stuff. And
they tried to put us with Flock of Seagulls one time.
Slayer, Flock of Seagulls, that would have went down in history.
But that's half the bands we played with back then.
They saw the videos, they saw the magazines, and what came out of Los Angeles, the bands that were super popular were the glam bands. And if you're in Europe, if you're in New York, you're from country on the other side of the world. Los Angeles heavy metal. What do they cover? There you go.
It's, as the saying was, glam stood for gay Los Angeles metal. and it's a lot of us were embarrassed by it almost, like we were from here, we lived here, this is where our bands had started. But man, we had to fight the good fight against most of what LA stood for, because it was not friendly to our scene. And that's why we'd have to go to these out-of-the-way venues in these kind of scummy parts of the town here, the city here, in order to play, and it was hard, man. It was we really had to think more like a punk band than like a big mainstream band. Even when we were signed to Capitol Records for our first couple of records, we couldn't think like hey, we're this big band on a major label. When bands usually here in town got signed to a major label, all of a sudden they had fancy clothes, fancy, haircuts, and they got all their endorsements and their gear, and they're on some big arena tour, and they're on MTV. And that wasn't how it was. I mean, look at the P-Cells video. I mean, it's filmed at Lemoore in New York, and it's really this very much this raw club kind of band,
For Abbotsford, we were more influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal sound, and the Rats were more influenced by more of the rock blues sound. So I guess it's just a variance of influences.
The glam scene, well, to be honest, they ran a scene so fast because a lot of bands got into it because they wanted to sell more than anything else. A lot of bands were more into image than into music, and they were too much on the self-destruct, sex, drugs and rock and roll path. And by the time you had a band like Trickster in the late 80s selling 1 million copies of a rubbish debut album, I know they're from New York rather than LA, but it's very much influenced by the LA scene, you knew the scene was over because it can't actually sustain rubbish like that continually selling. And the impact, the backfire was to take up pretty much everybody. And then of course grunge came along. But grunge was never going to affect thrash. It was always going to affect the likes of glam because thrash was very much of the street, glam wasn't.
It doesn't matter that grunge was out, grunge was absolutely influenced by metal and thrash and all that stuff. I wasn't bothered by their existence. Thrash metal, for me, was, I think that's the only kind of music that lived through, all the glam rock, cock rock stuff, that got killed. That got killed by grunge.
The girls absolutely hated us. But that was fine, As long as the guys got into the music, that's all we cared about.
With the glam shit, yeah, I mean, that was way more popular, and the thrash stuff was kind of always on the outer circle to some extent, even though we were playing with Slayer and all that, but it was still a little bit of the outcast kind of thing.
There was one night Slayer was playing the Woodstock, and we had a full house, packed. And Radio City, I walked over there because, now we're knowing who everybody is in LA. We all know each other now. So I walked next door and Rat's playing. And I looked inside and I giggled. They had like 17 people. Yeah. And at that point, I would have never thought Rat would have went off the way they did.
I look at all of it as being good. You know, if we wouldn't have had Rat and all those bands, we wouldn't have been pissed off enough to do thrash metal.
At times, maybe as we saw both of those worlds really take off, we might have said, what about us? But I don't think it was enough for us to go, let's rethink our whole style of our band. We never thought about that. We never really did. I mean, again, certain things might have influenced writing a little bit, but I think that in retrospect, we kind of created our own style and we stuck to that.
The local success of Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth opened the doors for many other LA-based power and speed metal contemporaries and newcomers like Abattoir, Hyrax, Savage Grace, Tyrant, Medusa, Agent Steel, Bloodlust, Heretic, and of course Dark Angel, which featured future thrash metal icon and former War God drummer Gene Hoglan.
Gene was one of these guys, according to his story, and I believe this, he didn't take lessons, but he did glom onto, if that's the right word, other drummers and try and absorb and seduce good stuff out of them. And at 14 years old, that's a great way to learn. You know, just show me what you've got. And I ended up over at his house one day, first time, and I didn't know him. And he was a, brooding, dark, long hair, dark sunglasses, giant 14-year-old. And he's got this silver drum set pushed up against the wall. He's like playing into a wall. I don't know why. Maybe it's to keep it a little quieter. And he started playing, and his foot was really fast. He's getting all these double bounces. He's 14 years old. I'm going, wow, this guy's good. But he's playing open-handed. That's drum tech term for left-handed on a right-handed set. And I just said, man, that's incredible. I mean, what you can do with that setup. I mean, you can have a mountain of cymbals over here and a mountain of drums over here. You don't have any ride cymbal in the way blocking. You put the ride assembly over here. And he said that having spoken to him that way made him feel like he wasn't a freak, that he had this great potential to do something that was really exceptional.
We could fit in. That was one thing I was never concerned about, ever, was fitting in with other people. But if you want to be in a working band, it's helpful if the band that you're in fits in with what people want to hear. That's where it's up to yourself as your own quality control to be like, okay, if my band is going to be in a group with 50 other bands, 40 other bands, whatever, I want to be in the best band of all of them. And that's why everything that we would, I would try to do with Dark Angel would be to try to make us, better than our last thing that we did.
And boy, as far as open-handed drummers goes, he's a top dog. Unbelievable drummer.
Dark Angel I took on because we use them as an opening act a lot down in the LA area, the East LA area, Orange County. They play with like those clubs, the halls I was talking about. They weren't getting anywhere, so I figured, because I love Jimmy Durkin and all that, so I figured I'd start helping them out and add a new band to the roster. Slayer didn't mind at that point because we were all friends.
We were all contemporary at the time, and we have like Ron moving over with Caton and forming a band there. Phantasm.
Years of hanging out in the LA scene, you make some good friends. Me and Ron McGovney were really good friends. I mean, after he left Metallica, it was tough for him because he's a pretty laid back dude. One day when I kind of took time off from Hyrax, I wanted to do a new project, and since me and Ron were hanging out all the time, I'm like, dude, you just need to play bass. Fuck sitting around.
Slayer, we had, it was Tom's garage, but we had that studio set up with our entire show in it. We had the drum risers, the guitar risers, we had lighting rigs in there. We had a mirror that went across the whole front so the band can see themselves. We went through a lot to fine-tune that band. We practiced 5-6 days a week, just to perfect what we were doing.
In between 83 and 86, there was Savage Grace, there was Ruthless, there was Bloodlust, later Agent Steel, Dark Angel. I mean, for God forbid you can't forget Dark Angel, because LA's own Caffeine Machine.
I would say the only band that we pretty much played was XL, No Mercy, and there was a band called Crux and Sauna that was doing more the whole suicidal, but more metal. There was one band that was called Attacks that was really, really good. Oh yeah, was really good. Harem Skirm was really good. They were called Bloodlust, but they changed themselves to Last Rites. They were really good.
It was just difficult, for lack of a better word, and but we got a lot of good attention, especially from Europe, and like the tape traders over there and the radio stations over there, and even Japan. We get fan letters and stuff like that, and interest from indie labels and stuff. So that really kept our morale up. But being in Hawaii, there's no scene at all, and you can't get gigs down there because there's no one else to play with you.
Obviously, we wanted to get as many fans as possible. It really didn't matter who they were, as long as it was on our terms. I think that it would have been the wrong thing to try to go and fit into a style that wasn't necessarily what we were about. Again, I say when we play songs like Madhouse and March of the Saint and Raising Fear, I mean they're pretty slamming songs, and they're basically thrashy type songs. But it's not only what we did, and it's it was not something that we said that's all we're gonna do, and therefore. I mean, we were touring with Metallica on Ride the Lightning with Kill 'Em All, with Wasp and Armored Saint, and March of the Saint tour, and Ride the Lightning tour, and we were seeing the fame that Metallica was garnering by doing that. But I still don't think it was something enough to go, well, let's forgo everything we're doing and do that. Let's only do that because that is where it's going. We didn't necessarily have the foresight of seeing where it was going to blow up to, and it didn't really matter. We just kind of stayed true to what we did.
Dude, I mean, we said, because we tried the radio-friendly approach and that didn't feel right, didn't really go anywhere. And then we said on these later albums, we said, fuck it, we're just going to do what we feel is fun and feels right.
It was like after Sound Barrier, because that's kind of what we broke up. Like Dave and Bernie was more going in a more of a pop metal direction, like a Dokken type of thing or something, and we were going more heavier. Stanley and I were just getting heavier and heavier and heavier, so it made a lot of sense just to go thrash,
The singer wanted to go more into a Queensryche direction, and I wanted to keep it more on a Skeptics Apocalypse kind of direction, more straight ahead thrash. So I got kind of disillusioned with it all, and Mel was upset with the direction of the second Abattoir album. So what happened was we just said, you know what, let's just make something heavier, and that's when we put out this record here, the Evil Dead EP. Intense heavy metal was just like from the English stuff, and then Metallica reinvented it. And in my own way, I thought I was reinventing it to some extent in Hawaii. I was putting like this unplayable kind of guitar element. There weren't a lot of guys who could play that kind of stuff. And if they were good enough to play it, they usually hated heavy metal, you know what I mean? Right. They were like jazzers, like, I can play it, but I hate it.
That was, just going to LA, when everything was so separated. And now everything's kind of the same everywhere. But back then, before cell phones and all that, the internet, I mean, it was really different everywhere. It was cool. It was cool to go to LA, and it was cool to go to New York because it was just different.
We had like a tiny bit of attention from Loud, Wild and Heavy, most of it negative. But when we did Natives of Restlessness, let's try to write some good songs that rock people can get into. And it was a sellout, but still with the elements of heavy guitar. We weren't selling out any more than like a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands were doing at the same time. Because, you gotta like move up, so we were trying to like broaden our fan base, and we did. In Hawaii, we opened for Deep Purple. We played a lot of as best gigs as you can in Hawaii, which is not that great. And we came to America and did a couple shows, which you were a part of there.
The one thing that is only going to rise in your future if you go heavier is the respect and astonishment of your fans that go, oh, God, you hear their latest records? Fuck, the heaviest thing they've ever done. Cool. I want to be a part of that record.
You know, we were really lucky, I think, at the time when we, you know, like when I joined the band and stuff for everything, the band's career just basically went on the upslide for so long, and it was really so cool. Just like really the right place at the right time, you know. And when Darkness came out, you know, obviously that was a real important record for us and got great reviews. I mean, it's still regarded as a top 20 thrash record of all time, you know, which is pretty fucking cool. Something that was recorded in 10 sessions. Right. You know, 10 sessions and mixed in 2 days.
Common misconception about thrash metal is that it caters strictly to the Caucasian community. In reality, thrash metal music is a global phenomenon which translates to more cultures and ethnicities than perhaps any other style of music.
A lot of the thrash for LA was in the outskirts. Definitely not Hollywood whatsoever. It all started in the outskirts. The East LA area, Pasadena area, for sure.
When those, you know, big four bands, these thrash bands were starting out, LA was saturated with Motley Crue and Rat and Dokken and you know, and there wasn't really a place for Slayer, and there wasn't really a place for Metallica. In Hollywood, at least, there wasn't. So they had to make their own places, and they would go outside of LA and they'd play like the Pomona Valley Auditorium, or they'd rent a warehouse, or they would play these crazy barbecues out in Pico Rivera, or the Pico Rivera Sports Arena and the swap meets and stuff like that. Like, that's where it started, like outside. And then people wonder why there's such a big Hispanic affiliation with these, you know, with thrash bands and speed bands, because these bands had to start outside of LA and they played in Hispanic neighborhoods.
The Latin community is responsible for a lot of the heavy metal.
So you had that branch of kids now, mostly from East LA, I'll give them credit. The death scene came about, and the hardcore world of you know, thrash hardcore. Then you had the glam going this way. You had the big rock going that way. You even had the Metallica Slayer split. But that's all from L.A.
Luckily, I came from a family that was really open-minded, so I didn't really think about it. Like, now when people hit me up about it, I'm like, wow, I guess that was pretty crazy. But I never thought about it unless somebody, and it rarely happened that people would say anything. But and if they were saying it behind my back, which was fine with me because I got pretty thick skin.
Just at that time, I was having a little bit of issue of getting in bands because of my skin color. So suicidal worked out because it didn't matter.
There wasn't a lot of blacks going to these shows. I mean, there was Caton, there was William Howell, there was Bill Montoya and me. I mean, there was not that many people, you know. So we played with Sacred Reich at Fender's Ballroom, and this guy actually like pointed to me and said, it's like, and said the N-word to me, and I actually threw down my bass and chased him out of Fender's Ballroom because it was like weird. I was like, I'm in an all-white band playing this music, and I didn't know how I was going to be accepted doing it. I mean, blacks didn't even accept me neither.
We didn't get accepted. You know, it's like Jimmy never got accepted correctly by his black peers. We haven't got accepted the way we should or why I would like. But you just go where the audience is. You know, guitars are something that doesn't fit into black culture. They like the saxophone. You know, it's not, guitars are not emphasized, but they like the blues, like Mr. King. You know, they like, Wes Montgomery and things like that. Jazz, more smooth, more laid back, but not the screaming, screeching guitar, not the feedback and the noise.
As the demand for thrash metal grew stronger, so did the competition and rivalry. Perhaps fueled more by fervent fans than the artists themselves, LA thrash bands not only found themselves competing with each other, but conflicts also sprung up rapidly between neighboring punk bands and fans alike. Despite the north-south rivalry between San Francisco thrash bands, LA thrashers built a strong kinship with Bay Area musicians and fans, often sharing the bill with Exodus, Violence, Possessed, Death Angel, Forbidden, and Legacy, who would later become Testament, as well as East Coast thrashers Overkill and Anthrax.
LA Metal Night in San Francisco, Brian Slagle, Heavy Metal Massacre, or the Metal Massacre, and it was like, somebody canceled, do you want to go? And we were like, let's go. And then we fucking threw our shit in a truck and drove up, and we played the Stone, and that was really, I mean, without being too dramatic about it, that was what changed everything.
You know, San Francisco was its own scene, and that certainly was inspired by Metallica and Exodus and those bands, Violence, and those bands that were more thrashy. And probably, you know, there's always that Northern California, Southern California competitive thing where, you know, we hate you. And the thrashing out of Northern California, I'm assuming the thrashing out of Northern California probably came in complete contrast to what was happening in Los Angeles.
That's really what originally got me into the whole, you know, whether it got big or not. I love the underground because everybody was so cool. We were all trying to exchange information, and, you know, and that's how we kind of started getting in touch with some of the bands from the Bay Area. Sure. But there was a big competition here in LA because Metallica was still here, Slayer was coming up, and the Hyrax was coming up, and then there was another band coming into the scene called Dark Angel, and they were really good too. We were so competitive at the time, we all didn't like each other.
Well, there was so much competition in LA, we had to do something to set us apart from everybody else. And again, we were fighting the system because there were no thrash bands, there was no speed metal. So we tried to combine as much as we could with the visual look, the stage show, the aggressiveness of the music. And like I said, we just kept going and going and going, and it wasn't paying off. Until we went to Frisco, of course.
You know, San Francisco gets talked about all the time, but LA had a fierce metal scene. You know, you could go into a club and see anybody from Savage Grace to Slayer playing together, or Hyrax and Dark Angel. You know, and before Metallica moved, they were still doing stuff too. But when they moved, that kind of made everybody kind of take it up a notch too.
But it wasn't until we went to New York and we played, I think it was L'Amour's. And the whole place the ceiling was sweating. That's how many people were in there. And I thought, holy shit, man, this is really insane. Where else are you going to find something like this with that much energy coming from, you could just feel it. It was like a microwave oven coming at you, you know? And so then we had to go on and play, and that was my first show.
Oh, L'Amour's.
Yeah, that was my very first show with Dave.
I think what it was is basically here in LA, when there was metal, there was all this other stuff that was going on that was in the mix, and you had San Francisco, and that's all it was just metal.
Steve Souza was in the band, and we were invited. It was after we did our demo, and this is when Megaforce started looking at us. I remember Metal Maria. Metal Maria's the one who got us signed on to Megaforce, and she got our tape, and she got us on that show, and it was Anthrax. They were still on Spreading the Disease. And it was Abattoir, Legacy,
Suicidals, and you had the Lads, you had all these different gangs. Circle One, yeah, tons of gangs. But you're right about that. San Francisco still has that camaraderie. I don't know, I mean, in LA, I think we try to work a little bit more towards that, but I think there's just even more of a fierce competitiveness here. I don't know what it is.
From that show, when Zet quit, we really made several attempts to get Abattoir singer in our band, and he just wouldn't do it. He was like, I think, you know, we were writing letters back then, you know, and then putting in the mail. He had the real long hair. I don't know his name. He kind of looked like Chuck a little bit, kind of.
Oh, okay, that might have been Mike Torres.
Mike, yeah, it was that guy. And we ended up finding his number. We called him up and we were chatting with him, and he was like, you know, I'm really dedicated to my band, and my band's gonna make it, and you know, good luck, but you know, I don't see it happening. And we're just like, please be in our band. And then you know, we really wanted him really bad, actually, and that didn't work out, and Chuck came along, and you know, it's history from there.
American thrash metal was birthed in the Orange County nightclubs with Metallica's very first show on March 14, 1982 at Radio City. A small, smoke-filled venue located in an industrial strip in West Anaheim. Radio City had a neighboring nightclub within crawling distance christened the Woodstock. which was Orange County's premier heavy metal nightclub. These two clubs, along with the Concert Factory in Costa Mesa, were the initial stomping grounds for Metallica, Slayer, Dark Angel, and Hyrax.
Woodstock, Radio City, and the Concert Factory were obviously kind of the backyard. Obviously, I remember the gig. We played a gig with Slayer at Woodstock, where I remember they played Highway Star, and they played some Judas Priest song. Yeah, some Judas Priest stuff, and they had all their makeup on. It was kind of a different thing than the makeup in Hollywood at the time, but I remember that.
Yeah, Orange County. I mean, Orange County probably is where most of the bands came from. It's certainly way heavier out there than it was in Hollywood or anywhere else. So another reason why, too, you know, when people look back and they say L.A., people in Orange County don't like to be mentioned in L.A.
The Orange County seen a lot more heavy venues we could play at. There was also the Cuckoo's Nest, which is the Concert Factory.
Orange County was our home base. The clubs there, Johnny Schultz gave us free reign to do whatever we wanted. We were building a following now, so it didn't seem feasible to move at that point.
There was the Hollywood scene, then there were people in Orange County. Two very divided areas of Orange County, or of Los Angeles, you know, and you know, the clubs that were down there were very separated, you know. It was not a united scene here as big as Los Angeles is.
Orange County had a lot to do with LA because we were close. We're not too far from each other, so a lot of the bands started coming together, and it was good for the scene too because you could play LA and Orange County, so you had more venues.
Denim jeans and vests, along with leather jackets, high-top sneakers, and spike bracelets became the outfit of choice amongst thrash musicians and fans alike. Lyrically, thrash metal distanced itself from cliched themes revolving around getting laid and partying, which were preeminent with glam and pop metal artists. Thrash lyrics were heavily inspired by death, destruction, and degradation, focusing on brute violence and sheer offensiveness. Taking inspiration from black metal renegades Venom and satanic doom metal messiahs Merciful Fate, LA bands such as Slayer were transformed from a British metal cover band into a demonic black metal band nearly overnight. But with the controversy came the censorship, which ultimately played in the thrash band's favor.
At the time, Ozzy Osbourne was getting a lawsuit for Suicide Solution. And I'm sitting back thinking, look at the press he's getting off this. And they're calling Ozzy a Satanist. I'm like, Ozzy's a businessman, nowhere near Satanist. So I approached him with the idea. I said, let's take this what's going on with Ozzy and let's just go in your face. There will be no need to run the records backwards because it's going to say it forwards. Strictly shock value. So the Venom thing, we used that and combined the two for that type of image and sound.
Is before there was power metal, there was speed metal. And for Agent Steel, we were more influenced by like I was saying, the new wave of British heavy metal, the Judas Priest, Rob Halford, and the Bruce Dickinson kind of sound on vocally. So we were more influenced by that. Now, like where the thrash scene came in my opinion, it was like like Venom, for example. Even though they're more like the black metal album, those kind of vocals, and Slayer kind of developed the thrash.
Now the sound, obviously, you know, came from Slayer playing with the Metallica one night, where the feud began. Yeah, because they were still doing Assassin and Delphic Oracle and Knight Rider, that type of music at the time. Played with Metallica and came back to the studio and the board was wiped out. We're starting clean. So we got this new sound that we heard from Metallica and this Venom and crossed them.
Man, there's no reason why you can't have some intelligence. I had no idea about, you know, trying to make things catchy or anything. You know, if you could shove 10 words in a line and when really 4 would have done well, throw those 10 words, giant polysyllabic lyrics into everything. And so, but bringing some intelligence to it, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, I loved Rush growing up, and it was just kind of a coincidence that I was the drummer of Dark Angel and Neil Peart doing his thing. But, he was an influence on me because Rush didn't care that, about writing about the party, like they abandoned their first album lyrically, as soon as Neil joined the band, obviously, and there was nothing wrong with bringing a little bit of brain to the bashing.
Our trip was more about aliens and stuff, lyrically speaking, and where Slayer was more about evil and Satan. But at the end of the day, it's all pretty much the same.
When we started Body Count, we were looking at what really scary. To white kids, skeletons and the devil and all that's scary. But really is scary is someone with a gun that's getting ready to rob you. You're getting carjacked. That's really scary because it can really happen. So that's what Body Count put forward. We brought that forward. Just street mentality to the record. You know what I mean?
Eventually, as we saw our guys in Metallica and Peers and even Anthrax, who it became a t-shirt and jeans kind of vibe, and we kind of wanted to start to shed that because we wanted to just be a band that we were taking serious on that level.
We couldn't take ourselves seriously as being a rock band or a metal band because for us there's humor everywhere, and for us, if we didn't find humor in what we were doing, we just weren't going to have a good time. So essentially we were mocking ourselves, having fun, and writing crazy party anthems.
He didn't like the last line. Last line, after he said it, I know I did the right thing when I beat her dead, because no bitch of mine gives out free head. That I said the last line for him. He says, we can't say that. And I go, no, you gotta say that. That's the way the song ends. That's the punchline. So
got no flack from the radio executives, huh?
No, they played it,
Yeah.
but they said they got a lot of calls from women's lib groups.
I know I did the right thing when I beat her dead, 'cause no bitch of mine gives out free head.
Street level rock and roll, nothing more, nothing less. We're not trying to. We want to be able to walk down the street. We couldn't walk down with red leather pants on.
And any thrash show, no matter if it was New York, LA, San Francisco, it was going to be violent. It was going to be crazy. There was going to be stage diving. There was going to be headbanging. You were going to leave there with bloody nose. But that's what was so rad about this fucking music, is that we weren't watching guys on stage doing their Axl Roses dance. We were watching guys just banging their heads who looked like us, who were fans of the music that we were into, and you left with war words. And as a kid, we all fucking loved it, especially dudes. We're like, oh, dude, you see my fucking nose? It was awesome.
So my idea was to get the band above in these nightclubs. So we started building those guitar risers so Jeff and Kerry can get up high. And then I wanted a blinding effect. That's why we built that A-frame. I wanted to be like, bombastic, just blind everybody to correlate with the aggressiveness of the music.
I grew up in Longview, Texas, which is in between Dallas and Shreveport, because where we grew up, it was the Bible Belt, and that kind of music was forbidden. It was kind of like the movie Footloose, where you'd have to kind of hide what you were listening to. What I used to do is, when I first got Slayer South of Heaven, I would take a blank cassette tape and I took the screws out of it and I took South of Heaven and I put it in that blank cassette tape so I couldn't get caught with that album.
Yeah, I remember Geraldo Rivera had a talk show, and he had one of his shows was on how to tell if your child is into devil worship. And people were looking for devil worship under every rock. And at the end of one of his shows, he had, of course, the 10 signs your child is listening to, is a devil worshiper. And one of them, I think it was number 10, was your child listens to Megadeth.
And I'll never forget the day that Geraldo Rivera did a special about how heavy metal is devil music, and if your kids listen to that, they're going to kill you and all that. And of all things, he puts the Megadeth Peace Sells But Who's Buying album cover up there. And I was like, oh, shit. And then my mom sees that tape, went to the trash.
You know why? And it's because Dave, he was a big reader of all that Black Magic and Lovecraft and just all that dark stuff. And basically, it's not like he wasn't a Satanist. It's just, he was darker than the rest of us, and that's where his lyrics came from. But he was also very political, so it was kind of a cool combination, I think.
The whole thing began. Now, Aggressive Perfector was the one that launched it. That was the turning point. But when Jeff wrote Die by the Sword, that's when we went full swing. And then right after Die by the Sword came the Antichrist.
I also played on the first record to ever get a parental guidance sticker. Ice-T's record, Ryan Pays, was the first record to ever get a sticker on it. So we've been bad dudes for a long time.
You could make or break your career on if you got a tipper sticker on your record.
The sticker was a good thing.
Yeah, it was great. That was the best thing you could hope for.
We just looked at it as a way they wanted to identify, just find the records and pull them out of stores, because then certain retailers stopped carrying the records and so on and so forth like that. At the time, we were so young and so not caring about that kind of stuff. It was just something they were doing.
Somebody at MTV had a problem with our name. It got yanked after a while.
I think with Dave's music is the lyrics are great, and that's and Metallica also great lyrics, and a lot of those bands. You're talking about all the bands that actually rose up out of all that. Their lyrics were really good, and the energy was always there, and our guitar tones got better and better and better, and I think that's how all those bands. That's why they're still here,
I'm not telling you shit. Sorry.
John Gallagher. We go way back.
That is true, Mr. Master Bob. It is true.
My first interview, by the way.
1900 and Frozen to Death.
Just before I interviewed the great Ronnie James Dio, the first was the great John Gallagher.
It's good company to be in, let me tell you.
Yes. Chilling.
Hey Greg, I gotta tell you that.
One night we have like a bass player, Mark, and I, and the bass player shows up with a Flying V bass. We have 3 Flying Vs going at one time there.
You actually jammed with that man?
Yeah, he was auditioning other people. So we were just there jamming.
There were people that took this very seriously. There were record-burning bonfires all over the country.
We would have to go out and hit every high school within a 10-mile radius, putting a flyer in every single
You're
walk.
talking about how
Going to a concert, you get drunk in the back of that and hit all the cars. You made a night of it, and you united with other people. You hung out, going to the Woodstock or outside.
Oh, but you go to the Woodstock and you've got all these other bands hanging out there.
But it was all an event. Putting a record out was a big deal. You had to work. You had to put effort into it. Show No Mercy came out after years of effort and work. Anybody could record a record now. The 4 of us could put a damn record out in the next hour.
Because we realized, you know, being from Germany, having a guy like Udo as the lead singer, I never realized right away we are different, and we don't have a chance to go mainstream, you know.
It was put actually very well by Bruce Dickinson with Maiden once. Judas Priest had the opportunity to move on to Screaming for Vengeance and make the really big album that was going to break them commercially. They didn't.
The Bonaventure Hotel, the famous New Year's party, 1982, 2 suites destroyed, blowing out plumbing, pulling the mirrors out of the wall, pulling bottles out of the windows. You were there, you know, Metallica, Armored Saint, all of us. It was just out of control.
Iron Maiden had the opportunity to do it around the time of Live After Death. They didn't. Pantera had the opportunity to do it with Vulgar Display of Power, or subsequently. They didn't.
You guys catch waves. We'll catch feathers.
So Rodney George was on guitar, and we had a young drummer at the time, Mr. Gene Hoglan on drums, and he had just been, Gene Hoglan, he did the demo.
Metallica, after Injustice for All, had the opportunity to do it. They grabbed that opportunity, made the Black Album, and sold 15 million plus, because they made it available and accessible to more than the diehards.